So now I'm going just to switch in English, just to welcome Léa, who is a little bit sick today, but I'm pretty sure that you'll give her all your energy by applauding her and welcoming her. So Léa, the stage is yours.
Hello everybody, thanks for being here. Like he said, I have a cold today, so I apologize in advance if I cough or anything in the microphone. I know it sounds terrible, but I'm sorry. So before I start, I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Léa. If you've ever heard my name before, it's probably due to one of my open source projects, the most popular of which are Prism, which is a syntax highlighter, Doublet.com, which is an online HTML, CSS, and JavaScript playground, Prefix Free, which is a library that helps you write CSS without prefixes, or CSS3test.com, and there are many others that you can find on GitHub or my own website. I used to work for W3C until the end of July. Now I'm writing a book for O'Reilly, and in my free time I'm an invited expert in the CSS working group that develops the CSS language. So enough about me. I'm sure you didn't come here to hear about that. Let's go to the talk to this talk. This is a bit different than the talks you've been used to. Instead of having a central theme, of course it has a central theme that's CSS, but it's more like 10 different independent little CSS talks about some things you might not know about CSS. And the more in the title comes from the fact that it's a sort of a sequel. I used to give another talk in the past that was called CSS Secrets. So this is more CSS Secrets. And with that, let's go to the first one. Unfortunately, Google Reader doesn't exist anymore. It's really sad because I used it every day. And it had some really nice UX touches. One of those was those little shadows it had at the top and bottom of the list of feeds. When you were scrolled up and you could scroll down, there was a shadow at the bottom indicating that you could scroll down. When you were midway, you could get shadows at the top and bottom, indicating that you could scroll either at the top or at the bottom. And when you were scrolled all the way to the bottom, there was this nice shadow at the top that indicated you could scroll up. And that was very useful because Google Reader didn't have any scroll bars. So Google Reader used JavaScript to create this effect. But you don't really need JavaScript for this. You can just do it with CSS, and it's actually pretty easy and pretty flexible. Before I get into the nitty-gritty of how you can do it in CSS, I will talk about something seemingly unrelated first, background attachment. And you might be wondering, what is there to know about background attachment? That's a very simple CSS property. Come on, I know everything about background attachment. And you probably know most there is about background attachment. As you probably know, there is a value called scroll, which means that if you scroll the page, the background moves as well. But if you scroll the element itself, that's scrollable, the background doesn't move. And there's also fixed. That means the background doesn't move regardless of whether you're scrolling the page or whether you're scrolling the element. But what if you want the background to move when you're scrolling the element? In CSS 2.1, we didn't have a value that did this. In CSS 3, we got a value that helps cover that gap, and it's called local. So what background attachment local does is that when you're scrolling the page, it behaves exactly the same way as scroll, but when you're scrolling the element, it scrolls as well. Here's a table that sums this up and makes it more clear what gap local is there to fill. And for a long time, I thought that, OK, background attachment local seems like something that was missing, but what exactly do we need it for? And then I found a use case. And this use case has to do with this Google Reader effect, these shadows at the top and bottom. So let's try to recreate this effect with CSS, and you'll see where background attachment local comes in. So let's first add a shadow with a radial gradient, which will be, there will be a radial gradient with a circle at the top and middle, so 50% horizontally, 0 vertically. And let's first make a really crude shadow from black to transparent, and we'll refine it later on. So now this is not a shadow at all. It's just, it occupies the entire element. So let's make it smaller with background size. 100% horizontally and only 15 pixels vertically. And we don't want it to be repeated either. So let's cancel background repeat. And now it's starting to look like a shadow, but it's still not quite there. We should move this color stop a bit so that it's more rounded. Yeah, something like this. And let's make it a bit semi-transparent, because black was a bit too intense. And this is still a bit too intense, so let's make it a bit more transparent. Yeah, that seems about right. So now we do have a shadow at the top, but if we scroll, it just stays there. This is not the effect we wanted, but we're getting there. At least we have the shadow now. So now the point is that when we're at the top, we don't want the shadow, and we want the shadow to be progressively revealed as we scroll so that it indicates that we can go up. So we will cover, the main idea is we will cover the shadow with a block of solid color, and this block will scroll as we scroll the element, revealing the shadow. So I will use a linear gradient to cover the shadow. I will make it red at first so that you can see what I'm doing, and I will change it to white afterwards. So now the red block is covering our shadow, whether we're scrolled or not. This is where background attachment local comes in. We will give the box a background attachment of local so that it scrolls when we scroll, and we'll give the shadow a background attachment of scroll, which is the default, so that it stays there. And as you can see now, when I scroll the element, the box scrolls as well, and it reveals the shadow. We're almost there. You can't see it very well because this is an awful red, but we're almost getting there. If I change this to white, we almost have the effect we wanted. When we're scrolled at the top, no shadow. When we scroll down, there's the shadow. This is almost what we wanted. The only problem is the shadow is not revealed progressively. It's revealed very abruptly because we're using a box to cover it, which is not what we wanted. To fix this, we can change this into a gradient, an actual gradient, instead of a box. So let's go back to red so you can see what I'm doing better. We will make this bigger, 100% and maybe 40. And we will make it into a gradient, at first from red to transparent. And you can see that this would kind of give us the effect we wanted. Transparent, though, we can't use transparent except where we have black to transparent, because transparent is just transparent black. So if we had red, we would use transparent red, which would be something like this. And if we have white, we would use transparent white, which would look like this. We're almost getting there, but now, when we're scrolled at the top, our shadow is not completely hidden. You can still see it a little bit. So we will make this a little lower so that it completely covers it. There we go. So now, we pretty much have the effect we wanted. It's progressively revealed. It's not there when we've scrolled up, and it's there when we've scrolled down. It's pretty trivial to get the shadow at both sides, at both the top and the bottom side. So this is the finished result. And this is how the finished code would look. We would have 4 gradients instead of 2. And we would have 4 background size values and 4 background attachment values. But it's basically the same logic. And we basically have the same effect, just with CSS. So you might be wondering what browser support would look like for this. It's actually pretty good. All you need for this is background attachment local. And that's supported by pretty much every browser in use today, except IE8, but that's being phased out very soon. And Firefox, until recently, didn't support it, but now they've recently implemented it as well. And because Firefox users upgrade very quickly, soon that won't be a problem. After all, this effect degrades progressively, degrades very gracefully. In browsers that don't support this effect, you just won't get a shadow at all. Everything will still work. You just won't get a shadow. And gradients support is a little bit worse. Mainly i9 doesn't support them, but you don't really need gradients for this. You can use SVG. You can use bitmap images. I've only used gradients here for convenience, but you don't need gradients to create this effect. And if you use SVG, you both get vectors, just like CSS gradients, and they're supported by i9. SVG is supported by i9. Of course, the caveat is that it requires a solid background. If you have a pattern as your background, it will be a bit trickier to implement. Not impossible, it depends on the kind of pattern you have. And I should credit Roman Komarov for this. He came up with the very first version. He was using pseudo elements, and I modified it to use background attachment local so that we don't need pseudo elements, because you might need your pseudo elements to do something else. So if I can avoid using pseudo elements for something, I'd rather avoid it. And with that, let's go to the second one. I'm sure you've seen this effect. It became quite popular a few years ago. Having multiple sections with different backgrounds, not necessarily solid color backgrounds like here. They could have different background images or whatever, but the background is fluid and the content is fixed width. Like, if I change the width here, the background would stay fixed width. The content would stay fixed width, but the background would be fluid. And in most cases, when people try to create this effect, they have multiple sections. They could be divs, they could be sections, whatever. And they have an extra wrapper div. So they use one of them for the background and the other one for specifying the fixed width. So usually, the wrapper div has a fixed width. In this case, it's 700 pixels. It could be anything. It could be in ems. It doesn't have to be in pixels. But usually, the idea would be this. And you would give it a margin of auto to stay centered. But that works, but it's a little bit suboptimal. What if you don't want an extra element? What if you're a purist and you want your HTML to just reflect your content and you don't want to have these ugly wrappers? Is there a way to do it without an extra HTML element? Let's think what margin auto does for a bit, because this is the magic one here. What margin auto basically does is that it takes the space that's remaining after you subtract the width, and it divides it by 2. So essentially, it's equivalent to using this. And yes, there is a calc function in CSS, and it allows you to do calculations between different units, between percentages and pixels, percentages and ems, whatever you want. It's so much better than, I'm sure many of you have used preprocessors, SAS, LESS, or whatever. It's so much better than what preprocessors have for arithmetic operations, because preprocessors are static. They can't know your context. They don't know the size of your viewport. They don't know anything about the resulting environment. They have to do everything before the CSS is processed. Calc is dynamic. Calc knows what your percentages mean. So when you say calc 50% minus 350 pixels, or 700 pixels divided by 2, it knows what these two are, and it will give you exactly what you expect. And the thing is, now that we've used calc here, there's no magic anymore. So instead of having a margin, we can just move it to the parent as a padding instead. So we can do this. We can change the margin into a padding, and we can move it to the parent. And now we don't need the wrapper anymore. We can just remove it and stay with our sections. So here, we have only a few sections. There are no wrappers. And for now, this CSS code applies to them, so they just have fixed width, as you would expect. And we can give them a padding of 50% minus 350 pixels. And that's exactly what we were looking for. Fixed content, fluid background. And if we want to make this even simpler, we can use 700 pixels divided by 2, which makes it obvious that it's the width value. So if we're using a preprocessor, we can use a preprocessor to specify a variable here. So we can change the width of the content in one place, and it would change everywhere. I'm sorry, that's what I was afraid of. Unfortunately, Calc doesn't have perfect browser support, but it's pretty decent. Mainly the problem used to be Opera until recently, but now Opera switched to Chromium, so now Opera supports it as well. And most other browsers support it. Just one thing, when I present these browser compatibility slides, I know I don't have any browser you might care about. I don't have mobile Safari there. I don't have the Android browser. These are not meant to be complete. They're meant to just give you an idea of how well supported the feature is. So mainly the problem here is old Opera, IE8 if you care about that. But you can always use a script, a very small script to detect whether Calc is supported and do it in JavaScript if it's not supported. It's a really small script, like 3 lines or so. And there's also a really hacky way to do it in CSS 2.1 if you don't want to use Calc. It's really horrible, though. Really dirty. If you can avoid it, please avoid it. I'm just going to show you because I think knowledge is important, but please don't use this. So you can use a large padding, like this, and then you can use an equally but opposite large margin, like this. And this does it, but it's so dirty. I should wash my hands now after doing this. But it works. So keep it in the back of your mind, and I hope it remains at the back. So let's go to the third one, which is one of my favorites. It's about light boxes. I'm sure you've seen light boxes, like when you have a photo gallery. Those became really popular a few years ago, but they're still being used a lot. When you have a photo gallery, or you want to open a dialogue or anything, when you have this effect where instead of just popping the full-sized image in front of you, it would open like this, first the width and then the height. Or, sorry, first the height and then the width. And when it would close the same way, first the width and then the height. And it would seem so smooth and impressive, and it would be like, wow, animations. Because back then, animations were really cool, because we didn't have CSS animations or anything. Most people use jQuery or things like this to do this kind of thing, but it will turn, as you will see in a few minutes, we can do it in CSS only. So here we've started to do something, but it's not working as we expected. We've only used a 1-second transition, which tells the browser, any property you can transition, please transition it. So it transitions the width and the height at the same time, which is not what we were looking for. Before we go into more detail about what CSS we're going to write here, this is how the HTML looks in this case. It doesn't have to be like that. This is just how it looks for the demo. And the CSS applied on it looks like this. Obviously, there's more CSS applied, but these are the bits that are important for this. At first, it has a width and a height of 0. It has a background of the image, and it has this box shadow. And when it's open, which this is obviously you need to use JavaScript. You always will need to use JavaScript for that. When it's open, it gets a class. The class is named current here, but it doesn't have to be. It could be named anything. Current was just convenient here because of my slideshow framework. So when it's open, it gets a width and a height of 70% and 80%. So let's go back to the demo. As you can see, this is a cool animation, but it's not what we wanted. So to do the kind of animation that's used on lightboxes, I need to tell you 3 things about CSS transitions. The first thing is, you can constrain transitions by property. When you don't specify a CSS property here, it tells the browser, transition anything you can transition. If you can animate something, please animate it. We don't have to be like that. We can tell the browser, please only transition the width, which means the height will just jump immediately, and only the width will have a transition. This might seem useless, but stay with me because it will be very useful when I tell you the other two things. So the second thing is you can introduce a delay. If you don't want the width transition to start immediately, you can specify a delay here. So here we've specified a delay of 1 second, which means instead of starting the transition, the width transition immediately, start it after 1 second has passed. So as you can see now, the height will transition immediately, but the width will take 1 second to start. And this also seems useless, but trust me, it's the third thing that makes both of them really useful. The third thing is you can have multiple transitions separated by commas with different parameters. So you can have one transition about width with different parameters and another transition about height with different parameters. So we can have a width transition that lasts 1 second with no delay, and a height transition that lasts 1 second with a 1 second delay. The transition is the height. Can you try to imagine what will happen now when I try to animate this? The width will transition over 1 second, but the height will have to wait 1 second to start transitioning, which means the width transition will have finished before the height transition starts. So effectively, we've managed to put them in sequence. So as you can see now, the width transition happens first, and then the height. Same here, the width first, the height second. That is what we wanted to do, one way of the transition, but it's not what we were looking for both ways. If you remember, it should be height first, then width, and when it closes, it should be width first, then height. This closes in the way we wanted, but when it opens, it looks a little bit weird. So can we have different transitions when it opens and different transitions when it closes? Of course we can. We can specify different transitions and different rules. So I will have this for a lightbox, and I will have a different one for a lightbox current. And I will copy this transition, paste it here, and then reverse these properties. So now it closes in the way I wanted, and it opens in the way I wanted. This is exactly the lightbox transition. Can we make it even better? As a matter of fact, we can do something else as well. See this box shadow that the lightbox has applied? You can see it over here, or here when it's open. So we can take advantage of box shadow to do something more than a shadow. We can also do the overlay. So we can have a box shadow with 0 offset, 0 blur, and a large spread radius, and a color of semi-transparent black. So this is a bit too dark. Let's make it 0.4. Yep. So now we also coded the overlay in CSS as well, but it doesn't animate. It's a box shadow. It can animate as well. It's an animatable property. So let's specify a transition for the box shadow as well, which would last 400 milliseconds. It would be last after the height. Sorry. And when they're reversed, it would be first. So no delay here, 0.4 delay here, and 1.4 delay here. So if I did this correctly, there will be there is an animation in the box shadow. It looks a bit weird. It shouldn't look weird like that. But I think you can see where I'm getting to. I won't debug this live, but you get the main idea. I've actually used this technique in the web platform homepage. How many of you know what a web platform is? Okay, web platform is a documentation effort by W3C and many other companies. It's a wiki, so it's awesome. So when I was working at W3C, one of my tasks was to work on this, with many other people, of course. And one of the things I did was this light box. So when you open this, it uses the same, pretty much the same light box effect I showed you. Obviously, the box shadow works correctly here. This should be a video, but I've blocked Flash videos here in this browser. And when it closes, it also has the same effect. And the JavaScript required for this lightbox is tiny, exactly because I've done as much as I could with it in CSS. The JavaScript for it is not more than 20 lines, maybe even less. And the thing is, it works in IE8 as well. You just don't get an animation. You don't get an overlay, but it works. And we're talking about an ancient browser, right? IE8 is pretty ancient these days, but it still works, because that's the point of graceful degradation. It works in older browsers, it just doesn't have the nice effects and the bling and all that. So the browser support for transitions is not perfect. Basically, it's supported by every browser in use today except IE9 and below. I10 supports transitions and animations. If you don't like that, you could use a fallback in JavaScript, or you could just accept the idea that in older browsers, everything will still work, just no effects. And let's go to the fourth one. So here's some lined paper text. I'm sure you've seen lots of it before. The passage is just, instead of lorem ipsum text, I've used a passage from one of my favorite books. And however, this is special lined paper text. If you change the font size, it adjusts. If you change the padding, it also adjusts. This is quite unlike most cases where we just slap a background image there, and if anything changes, our design breaks. This is flexible. So how can we do this? The key is the line height here, and you'll see why. First, let's add a background image of a linear gradient. You don't need to use linear gradients. I will just use linear gradients because it's simpler. And the linear gradient will not, it won't actually create any gradient, just one black line. And now you can't see it because it's just one black line at the top, and it's hard to see. But if I change the background size to, I don't know, 40 pixels and 100% horizontally, you can see it. But the lines are still not aligned. The trick here is, instead of specifying a hard value in pixels, you specify your line height, which is 1.2, or 1.2 ems, it's the same. And you also size your background as 1.2 ems. And the size of these lines is exactly the same as the size of lines in your text. Obviously, you need to adjust the background position as well. So let's say, and you should also size the background position in ems, otherwise, if you change the font size, the background position will break. So yeah, something like that would work. So now if I change the font size, it adjusts. However, if I change the padding, it doesn't adjust that yet, because there's nothing in there that depends on the padding. Background image doesn't depend on the padding. Background size doesn't depend on the padding. It depends on the font size because we use ems, but it doesn't depend on the padding. So obviously, everything breaks when you change the padding. But it doesn't have to be this way. There's a property called background origin. And what background origin does is it specifies what your background position refers to. By default, it refers to the inside of your borders, which is where the padding begins. But if you change background origin to content box, it refers to the inner edge of your padding. So, did I make a typo here? So by default, background origin is padding box. That's weird. Well, that's a problem you often get with live coding. Something always breaks. Sorry about that. Let me try to type this again. If I made a typo, I can't see. Background origin content box. That's strange. I was pretty sure it worked. I swear it worked earlier. Sorry about that. Hopefully you learned about a new property, even though I can't actually show you that it works. And here is another example of this. And I really hope this one works, because otherwise I'll feel really bad. So quite often we want to do zebra striping in tables or in text. Zebra striping is when you have one line with one color and the next line with a different color. And when we got nth child selectors in CSS 3, we all started using this to zebra stripe our tables, and you could see this effect everywhere there were tables. Because in the past, we had to use scripts to do this. We had to use JavaScript, or you had to do it in the server and add different classes. So when we got nth child selectors, it was really easy. You just wrote nth child odd or nth child even, and you got and specified a different background color, and you got zebra striping. But we still couldn't do it in text. Because you don't get nth child selects elements. You don't get different elements per line. So if you wanted to do zebra striping in text, you still had to wrap every single line of your content in a different color, in a different element, sorry. So that would be a bit inefficient. You don't want to have a different element for every line in your HTML. That's too slow. If you have, DOM elements don't come for free. The more DOM elements you have, the slower your page becomes. And if you have lots of content and you use one element for every line, that's really slow. However, there is a way to fake it with CSS. You can again use a gradient for the background of every 2 lines. So let's try to do that. Now it's a proper gradient from white to beige, as you can see. We will make these color stops meet in the middle. So we will basically have an image that's half white and half beige. So now it occupies the entire element, so there's a hard break here. But if we use background size, and we give it a height of 3ems, because our line height is 1.5, and our background is for 2 lines, so we need to give it double the size of the line height. So 3ems, and that's exactly the size of our lines. If we change our lines, it will still adjust now. As you can see, it grows as well. But obviously, we need to adjust it for the padding. So we can use background origin. And I will give it a shot again. I don't know what I did wrong before. Here it works. Thanks, and sorry about the previous one. So here it works. And if I change the padding, as you can see, it still adjusts. So there. Otherwise, you wouldn't believe me that a background origin property works. So I'm glad it worked here. So Background size has a browser support of, that's pretty good. Basically, it's only IE8. As far as CSS3 properties go, this has some of the best browser support. Background origin has exactly the same browser support as background size, so I don't have a slide for that, because it's exactly the same as this for background origin. And I've shown you the browser support for gradients before. It's not perfect, but even in this case, you don't need gradients. You can just use an SVG with 2 rectangles to have the 2 lines. Or you can use an SVG with 1 small rectangle to have your lined paper effect. And it will be a really tiny SVG. You can even include it as a data URI. Of course, linear gradients are the simplest, but I understand if you want to support IE9. Although, this also degrades very gracefully. If you decide to use gradients and gradients are not supported, you just don't get a lined paper effect. You just don't get the zebra striping. You still get a solid color background, and everything works fine. So it might be a good thing to consider if it's not completely essential that you get the lines. So let's go to the 5th one. So here we have a kitty that's cropped in a diamond shape. And you can see the HTML of this when I hover over it. It has 2 elements. It's an image. It's an image, and it's wrapped by an A element, which is important here because we will need the 2 elements. Unfortunately, the technique I'm going to show you requires 2 elements. But you won't have to crop the element in Photoshop or anything. You can just crop it in CSS. So if you want to change the shape, you can just change your CSS. So here I have the same HTML, but with less CSS applied. So basically, I have here is a rule for the outer element with an outline so that you can see where the limits are. I can show you the full background image. It must be kitty JPEG. Yep. So this is the image we have. Obviously, in actual cases, you would prefer to have a smaller image because you don't want to waste bandwidth, but let's go with that for this. So we would apply overflow hidden because we don't want the extra image to show. We would give it a CSS transform to rotate it. But now the kitty is rotated as well. So we need to write an extra rule for the image inside. And let's give it a different max width because we want it to be a bit smaller. Or actually, let's make the transform first. So the trick here is to give it an opposite transform so that the kitty is not rotated, but the outer shape is. So the outer shape will be rotated and it will give you the diamond shape, but the kitty inside won't be rotated because we will rotate it with the same amount of degrees the other way. So there you go. Now we need to make it smaller. How smaller? You might think this would work, but this would make it too small. This would work if you wanted an octagon shape. If you remove the outline, you'll see this is a useful shape as well. Oops. OK, I clicked on it. I shouldn't have. So this would work if you wanted an octagon shape. But if you want a rhombus shape, that won't work. We need to make it bigger first. How bigger? About this bigger, because it's square root of 2 multiplied by 100. But this would work if you can make it a little bit bigger than needed, or this, or whatever. And we should move it a bit higher up. Otherwise, it's a different kind of diamond shape. So we apply a translate Y transform, and we start moving it to the top until it feels right. There's actually a geometric way to figure this out, but if you don't want to make calculations, you can just play with it until it looks right. As long as you use percentages and be flexible. So there you have it. Can you do other things with this technique? David Story used the same technique, well, a similar technique, he used skew transforms instead of rotate transforms to do this sort of panel. Obviously, he's using animations and stuff as well, but this has no JavaScript. This is just CSS. And he's just using skew transforms to do this line in between them. And he's canceling the skew transforms and the images inside. I've also used the same technique to crop a kitty in a hexagon shape. I've shown you how to do it in diamond shapes and octagon shapes, but hexagons are actually pretty tricky. If you see the transforms required, they're a bit more difficult to come up with. And obviously the caveat is that it requires an extra HTML element. It's kind of annoying. It's not too important, but it's still kind of annoying. And CSS transforms have pretty decent browser support. Even i9 supports them, or Safari 3.1. Basically, if you don't mind about IE8, every browser supports them. And with that, let's go to the sixth one. So this is very similar. I know it doesn't look similar to the previous one, but the idea behind it is very similar. So I'm sure if you've ever seen CSS animations before, you know how to move an element in a circular shape, but the element itself would rotate as well. It wouldn't be like this. It wouldn't be moving in a circular path. It would also be rotating around itself. So a friend of mine came to me, Chris Goyer of CSStricks.com, if you know that website. It's pretty popular if you're into CSS. So he came to me a few years ago, and he was like, can you think of any way to do this? And we couldn't think of anything back then. So we concluded that the only way to make an element move in a circular path in CSS would be to just approximate the circular path with multiple keyframes, which is very suboptimal. So it bothered me, and I tried to think of a better way. And a few months later, I don't remember what I was doing, but it suddenly popped in my head. Oh, we could do it this way. We could make the element rotate around a point so that it rotates in a circle, and then we could also make it rotate around itself the opposite way, so that the rotations cancel each other and we only see the movement. So let's see how this works. We have a trivial keyframes rule. If we apply this animation to the element, you can see that it rotates around itself. We can make it rotate infinitely. Let's make it linearly. But it rotates around itself, right? We can give it a transform origin. Let's see, is the center here? Yeah. We can give it a transform origin of somewhere around here so that it rotates around the center point, so it starts rotating in a circle. These two animations separately are not what we wanted. But if we combine them, they're basically exactly what we wanted. So here we have two elements. Oh, here we have one image only. So we can't use both animations together because we need one animation that rotates it with a transform origin and one animation that transforms it with a different transform origin. And we can't have two transform origins on the same element, so we need two elements. But here that we wrapped it with a div, we wrapped the image with a div, we were able to do it. We just had to write two animations and apply this, and apply one animation to the outer element and the other animation to the inner element. Here, we did it like this here because we wanted to reuse these parameters and only cancel the animation name. In fact, we don't even need two animations here. We don't need this. We can avoid it. We only need one animation. So instead of overriding the animation name here, we can override the animation direction, because basically the second animation was the first one reversed. So if we reverse this, it's the same thing. But we still need two elements. And this bothered me, so I wrote to the CSS working group, and I was like, we need to allow multiple transform origins per element. So a guy called Aria Gregor asked me, is that syntactic sugar for something we can already do today? Or is it a new thing that we can't do today? And I was like, we can't do this today. We can't specify multiple transform origins on an element in any way. So he gave me this code. And he was like, there you go. You don't need an extra element now. And I was like, wow, I don't understand what's happening here. So I spent a while trying to figure this out, and at some point it clicked, and I realized what this was doing. Basically, don't see this as a whole. Try to picture every single frame that's generated, because you get these two keyframes, but the browser generates lots of intermediate frames to do the animation. So you start from 0 here and 0 here. You end with 360 here and minus 360 here. So at any random point, you have a rotation by a certain number of degrees. Then you move by 330 pixels. And then you rotate by the same amount of degrees the opposite way. So if you keep in mind that transforms change the entire coordinate system, transforms are not individual. If you write a transform, translate, rotate, and a transform, rotate, translate with the same parameters, they're not the same transform. They're different because order matters. Every transform you write operates on the coordinate system that the previous transforms operated on. So when you rotate and you translate afterwards, the translation moves the element according to how many degrees you've rotated before. It doesn't move your element in the same direction regardless of anything that came before it. So here you rotate your element, you move it 330 pixels, you rotate back, so these two rotations cancel each other, and you just see the movement. You just see the result of the translation. So CSS animations, browser support for them is not perfect. It's similar to gradients. Basically, i9 doesn't support them, so that's a problem. In some cases, it would be acceptable to just accept that and accept the idea that you won't have animations in older browsers. In some other cases, you might want to do a fallback with JavaScript. And this is the guy that came up with the code I showed you at the last slide. I think he's a genius. So let's go to the 7th one. And here we have a speech bubble, but this is not about how we can create speech bubbles. I'm sure most of you know that. Here's about adding shadows to speech bubbles, or other shapes. Because if we do a typical box shadow like this, and you can see it doesn't work. Because this is a pseudo element, the box shadow doesn't follow it. The box shadow is basically only a rectangle. Sometimes it's rounded if we have a border radius, but that's it. It doesn't account for anything else. It doesn't account for decorations, for transparent backgrounds, for anything else. So, do we have to settle that we won't be able to have shadows in speech bubbles or other other elements with decorations? No, but we have to settle with the idea that we won't have perfect browser support if we try to add shadows, because this box shadow will not work to do this. There's another thing that will, though, and it's called the filter property. And don't freak out, this is not the filter property that IE used to support. This is a completely different specification. So filter is basically about doing SVG filters on HTML content with simpler syntax. You don't even need to know SVG to use the primitive filters. You can just do a drop shadow effect, provide the shadow as a parameter, and it works the way you would expect, and you don't have to study a single SVG element. You don't need to even know SVG is there. And it works in the same way you would expect for everything. Any transparent region you have is shadowed the way you would expect, which might or might not be useful in some cases. So here, we have a transparent background, a dashed border, and some text. So if we try to apply a background, you can see that this looks horrible. We can also do it with a drop shadow filter. Which doesn't look so great, because the text is really hard to read. So we wanted the shadow here, but we didn't want it at the text. How can we cancel it from the text? Some of you might suggest that we could use this, but it doesn't work because they're completely different systems. In fact, if you have a text shadow, let's say 1 pixel, 2 pixels, whatever. I'm just writing a random shadow here. So let's say you have this white shadow. The thing is, because they're completely different systems, the shadow is shadowed as well. The text shadow has its own shadow. The text shadow has its own drop shadow. So there are we have the text, we have the shadow of the text, we have the text shadow of the text, and we have the drop shadow of the text shadow. It seems crazy, but that's how it's supposed to work. I can see a yo dog meme here. Something like, yo dog, I heard you like shadows, so I put a shadow in your shadow. I should make that. So CSS filters don't have very good browser support. I'm sorry about that. It doesn't support them at all, even in IE10. Opera only recently started supporting them. Chrome was the first that supported them, basically WebKit. And Firefox doesn't quite support this syntax, but it supports a different syntax. Firefox always supported, well, from a very early version, Firefox supported SVG filters, proper SVG filters, on HTML content. So you can use an SVG file for the filter, and you can link it in the same way you link filters in SVG. And you can use these two along each other, so that when Firefox supports filters in the simpler syntax, it will just use the second declaration. I know it's not perfect, but it's much better than having no shadow. And let's go to the 8th one. I only have 5 minutes left. That will be difficult. So the 8th one is also about filters. Have you noticed how in my numbers here, the background is blurred? And it's not just a transparent background like it is here. How can we do that in CSS? Usually, in the past, when we wanted to do that, we used a hack where we had a background, and we also had a blurred version of the same background. So we overlaid them, and we positioned them so that they are above each other, and we created this illusion. We can do something similar with filters so that we don't need 2 different background images, but it's still equally hacky. So obviously, we can't apply a blur filter here, because what will it do? It will blur the whole element. That's horrible. It's impossible to read now, and it makes me feel I'm drunk. So we will add it on a pseudo element, like before. We will give it some content so that the box is generated. We will position it absolutely. The parent already has relative positioning. And we'll give it offsets of 0 so that it extends the whole, it occupies the same space as its parent. Let's give it a background of red to see where we are. As you can see, it's on top of the text. So we'll use a z-index of -1 to place it behind the text. And can we blur now? Nope, we can't, because basically what we're doing is that we're just blurring this element that has no content. But instead of giving it a background of red, we can give it a background of the page, the element we have behind. Give it the same background attachment as what's behind. A background size that's the same as what's behind it, which is cover. And a background position of center, which is also what's behind. And now it works, and it's very flexible. I can move them in any way, and it will still work. I can give it any position, any size. And there it is. And yes, I know this is not what should be. This should be easier. There should just be a property to do this. You shouldn't have to use pseudo elements. But at least it's possible without having to use an extra blurred background image. So yeah, the caveats are pretty obvious. It's messy, it's even messier when in other cases, but it's better than nothing. And this is a cool effect you can do with blur filters. It's a bit unrelated, but I thought it was cool. And CSS filters have the same browser support I showed earlier, but the filter for Firefox is much easier because blur is a filter primitive, so it's just basically one filter, and the rest is just craft. So for the 9th one, I will have to switch to Firefox. This is some justified text. How many of you are designers? OK, not many. So not many of you will be cringing right now, because justified text in CSS used to be a no-no until very recently, because of those rivers of white space that are horrible. And in print, we have hyphenation. In CSS and in web design, we didn't have hyphenation until recently. But in CSS text level 3, we did get hyphenation, and it's just one simple property, hyphens auto. Now it works, hyphens. And it follows the language. I just dropped my microphone here. And it follows whatever language you've specified in your HTML. So it doesn't have to be English. If you specify French, it will just hyphenate in French. It's really clever. But browser support is not perfect. Only i10, Safari 5.1, and Firefox 6. And even worse, although obviously it degrades gracefully if it's not supported, you just don't get hyphenation. And Chrome is being a huge troll. Because not only doesn't it support it, but it doesn't allow you to detect it. It lies. It flat out lies about supporting it. If you try to detect support of hyphens with JavaScript, Chrome will tell you, yeah, sure, I'll support it. And it won't do anything with it. It's really horrible. Oh, whatever. So, and the last one, do I have time? Almost. I started 10 minutes late. So, we have a frames PNG, 500 pixels long, and we have this div that's 50 pixels long. This is the CSS that applies to it. I'm sorry I'm speaking really fast, but otherwise I would just have to jump to the end. So we can see that if we change the background position here, we see different frames. But if we want to do a keyframe animation on this, from 0, that's already here, so we don't need a from keyframe, to background position, minus 500 pixels and 0. And we attach it here. We don't need the border anymore. Wave, let's say 2 seconds, infinite linear. This is not what we wanted. This is not a frame-by-frame animation. So what can we do? Instead of linear, we can use another easing function called steps. And we can specify the number of steps we want. So if we specify 10 steps, this is exactly the frames we have. So it becomes a frame-by-frame animation. We can give it 1 second here to make it more convincing. There you have it. And you might be wondering, why do we need a CSS way to make animated GIFs? But PNGs can have alpha transparency, which animated GIFs cannot. So if you need something semi-transparent that animates, this might be very useful. There was an image format called APNG, but this actually has better browser support than APNG, believe it or not. I have to credit Simre that first came up with this idea about this animation. And this is the browser support for steps. It's basically, it's pretty much the same browser support as animations, a little bit worse, but not significantly anymore. And this is another thing you can do with step-by-step animations. It's basically the same thing, except it uses another thing that's pretty cool, the CH unit. The CH unit means the width of the 0 character, which is pretty useless in average fonts. But it's very useful in monospace fonts, because in monospace fonts, the width of the 0 character is the same width as every character. And this is the browser support for the CH unit. Obviously, you need to hard code the character count in the CSS for this effect, so it's not perfect, but it's pretty cool for headings and stuff like that. And since we won't have time for questions, here's one of the questions I'm often asked about my talks. How did you make it? It's built with open web technologies, basically a web application. My slideshow framework is on GitHub. Syntax highlighting was done with Prism. There wasn't much syntax highlighted code, but there was a bit. And you can find the slides online here, my website / more CSS secrets. So if you were taking notes, I'm sorry, but you didn't need to. And well, question everything in general. We won't have time for questions, though. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Léa. Thanks so much for being here and putting all your energy you still had.
Thanks for having me. I hope I didn't cough very much on the microphone.
Oh, that was quite good. It's cool. Thanks.